The music stopped before the screaming started. That was the detail no one could explain afterward, how a 300-guest gala, glittering with candlelight and violin strings, could go from champagne laughter to absolute silence in the space of 4 seconds. One moment Eleanor Voss was dancing at the center of her own charity ball, sequins catching the chandelier light, a smile that raised $11 million a year for children's hospitals. The next, she was on the floor, and no one in that room of surgeons, senators, and self-made millionaires knew what to do. Nobody except a man standing against the far wall in a plain black uniform, a laminated badge clipped to his chest. A man most of the 300 guests had walked past all evening without once looking at his face. His name was Marcus Deng. He was 44 years old. He had worked building security at the Whitfield Grand Ballroom for 6 years, and in that time, exactly 2 people had ever asked him his name. What happened in the next 90 seconds would end up on the front page of 3 newspapers. But it started quietly, with a man nobody had bothered to see. Marcus had taken this job the way a person takes a life raft. Not because he wanted it, but because it kept him afloat. Before the black uniform, there had been another uniform, desert-colored, and 11 years in the Army as a combat medic, 4 of them in forward positions where the difference between a person living and a person dying came down to what he did with his hands in the first 2 minutes. He had held pressure on wounds that should have ended lives. He had talked panicking men through their own bleeding. He had done things in dust and heat that no gala guest in this glittering room would ever have to imagine. Then a roadside explosion had taken his hearing in one ear, scarred his forearm from wrist to elbow, and sent him home to a country that thanked him at airports and then quietly declined to hire him for anything resembling what he actually knew how to do. Hospitals wanted certifications he no longer had money to renew. Ambulance services wanted him retrained from scratch, a process that cost time he didn't have while paying rent on a 1-bedroom apartment that ate most of what security work brought in. So he stood at doors in a rented tuxedo black uniform, checked names against clipboard lists, and watched people who had never once had to save a life walk past him toward the bar. He told himself it didn't matter, that a job was a job. But some nights, watching wealthy men complain about slow valet service, something in his chest tightened like a fist around a memory of what actually mattered. Eleanor Voss had built the Whitfield Foundation from nothing after her own. Daughter survived a childhood illness that nearly didn't let her. She was 61, sharp-eyed, fiercely private about her health, and utterly convinced that stopping for anything was a weakness she couldn't afford. She had felt the tightness in her chest 20 minutes before she collapsed and told no one, because there were donors to greet and a keynote still to deliver. When she went down hard, her head missing a marble column by inches. For 3 full seconds, no one moved. A senator's wife screamed. A man in a tailored suit fumbled for his phone, not to call for help, but to film. Somebody shouted for a doctor, and 3 surgeons in the crowd, men who had spent decades in operating rooms, stood frozen, because saving lives in a sterile theater with a team and instruments was a different universe from saving one on a marble floor in real time with nothing but hands. Marcus was already moving. He didn't run. He had learned long ago that panic wasted seconds, and seconds were the only currency that mattered. He crossed the ballroom floor in long, even strides, dropped to his knees beside Eleanor Voss, and pressed 2 fingers to her throat. No pulse. Not breathing. "Someone call 911 now," he said, his voice carrying a calm that cut straight through the noise. "Somebody count with me out loud." A woman in a beaded gown, one of the hospital board members, stared at him. "Who put you in charge?" Marcus didn't look up. He was already tilting Eleanor's chin, clearing her airway, positioning his hands on her sternum with the precision of 1,000 hours he'd spent doing exactly this in far worse conditions than a marble ballroom floor. "I did," he said. "Call now." He began compressions. 30, hard and fast. The rhythm of a song he'd once been told to hum to keep the timing right. A song called "Stayin' Alive." and some cruel corner of his memory noted the irony even as his arms burned with the effort. The crowd had gone from silence to a low, horrified murmur. A man in a tuxedo, Eleanor's grown son David, pushed through the circle of guests, his face the color of ash. "That's my mother. Get away from her." "Where are the real paramedics?" "Paramedics are 8 minutes out," Marcus said, not breaking rhythm. "She doesn't have 8 minutes. You're a security guard." David's voice cracked with fear disguised as fury. "You don't know what you're doing." Marcus finished a set of 30 compressions, tilted Eleanor's head, and delivered 2 rescue breaths, watching her chest rise. Then he went back to compressions without answering, because arguing cost breath, and breath cost time, and time was the only thing standing between this woman and the end of her life. 20 seconds passed. Then 40. The 3 surgeons in the crowd had finally moved close enough to see, and one of them, an older man with silver hair, crouched beside Marcus and said quietly, "Compressions look textbook. Keep going. I'll watch her color." "Copy," Marcus said, and something in the single military word made the surgeon glance at him differently. At the 90-second mark, Eleanor's body convulsed. A weak, rasping breath tore out of her. Her eyelids fluttered. The room, which had been holding its breath as one organism, released it all at once. Someone sobbed. The surgeon pressed his fingers to her wrist and said, "Pulse. Weak, but there," and his voice shook on the last word. Marcus sat back on his heels, chest heaving, sweat cutting a line down his temple, and for the first time since he'd crossed the ballroom floor, he let himself feel how hard his hands were shaking. Paramedics arrived 4 minutes later to find Eleanor Voss breathing on her own, a security guard's rented jacket folded under her head, and a room full of the city's wealthiest people staring at a man they had walked past all evening, as though he were part of the furniture. David Voss knelt beside Marcus as the paramedics worked, his anger gone, replaced with something rawer. "How did you—" he started and couldn't finish the sentence. "I used to do this for a living," Marcus said quietly. "Before I stood at doors." "Before?" "Army medic. 11 years." Marcus looked down at his own hand, still trembling. "Nobody asks a man in this uniform what he used to be." David Voss said nothing for a long moment. Then he said the only thing that made sense to say, "I'm sorry. I didn't see you at all until you were the only one who mattered." Eleanor Voss spent 6 days in the hospital and came out with a diagnosis, a pacemaker, and a question she couldn't stop asking everyone around her. Why had the man who saved her life been standing at her door for 6 years without her ever learning his name? She found out everything within a week: the discharge, the unrenewed certifications, the retraining programs that cost more than he earned in 2 months, the quiet, grinding math of a life spent capable of saving people and unable to afford the paperwork that would let him do it professionally again. What she did next wasn't a headline-grabbing gesture. She didn't hand him a check on a stage. She called the director of the city's largest trauma center, a man who sat on her hospital board, and asked a single question. What would it take to get Marcus Deng's paramedic certification restored, fully funded, no strings? Starting immediately, it took 6 weeks, a waived tuition, and a letter of recommendation written by 3 surgeons who had watched him work a marble floor like it was a battlefield. Marcus Deng started paramedic training that spring. He kept the security job on weekends, not because he needed to, but because he said the lobby of the Whitfield Grand Ballroom was where his life had changed, and he wasn't in a hurry to walk away from it. Eleanor Voss attended his certification ceremony 7 months later, sitting in the 3rd row in a plain gray coat instead of sequins, and when they called his name, she was the first person on her feet, somewhere in a city full of people who mistake a uniform for the whole of a man. There is still a door that Marcus Deng stands at some weekends, nodding politely to guests who don't know his name, and a woman inside who never again forgets to ask. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Kindness Tales for more stories of courage, grace, and the small human moments that change everything. And tell us in the comments, has someone ever underestimated you before truly seeing what you could do?